CME, narrated by Rod Nation of Radio 1. It was around autumn in 1996. My wife, our 8-month-old son and I lived in a tiny village in northern New South Wales. We were still very much L-plate parents when we all came down with a strange virus. It was strange because we all got sick simultaneously. Typically, when a flu or a bug goes through a house, it seems to go from one person to another over time, but not this one. This bug hit us like a freight train. I don't have many memories of when I was sick, but I remember apples, and I'll get back to that later. My temperature was over 40 degrees. My wife's and son's was hovering around 39. We were too sick to drive the 36-kilometre round trip to the doctors in our nearest town. We were too young to realize that we should have called an ambulance. This is because it was drummed into us that ambulances were for emergencies, only, like heart attacks. So, after 3 days of being very sick, my wife, who was still ill, drove the three of us to the doctor's surgery. I have no memory of this. My wife says the doctor was happy to send me home because my temperature was dropping. He did say if it hadn't come down, he would have hospitalized me immediately. Because my wife and son were also improving, they were given the all-clear to go home as well. One would have thought that given our young ages, myself 27, my wife 23, that would have been the end. It was barely the beginning. The doctor had put me on antibiotics, which, after the bug had cleared, caused a yeast infection, so it was back to the doctors again. I do remember joking that if you shook me, I'd rattle from all the medications I was taking. Before this, I was extremely healthy and as fit as a fiddle. I weighed about 60 kilograms, I wasn't on any regular medications, and visits to the doctors were rare occurrences. I remember not having much energy for about 2 weeks after the bug, which I found frustrating because I was a really active person. About 3 weeks after the virus, it was a Sunday, I was in Lismore, learning to fly a radio-controlled plane at an oval near the Southern Cross University when something strange happened. It was a day of great activity. I drove the 30 kilometres to Lismore. I spent the morning learning about the basics of model aircraft, controls, engines, fuel, and a safety briefing, and I was then allowed to take control of a plane using a buddy system. So I had a controller, and the aircraft's owner and instructor had another controller hooked to mine so that he could recover and take control if I stuffed things up. I was concentrating really hard, and my flying wasn't bad, if I say so myself. I was flying a racetrack around the flying area, I was keeping my turns pretty coordinated, and things were great. Well, they were on the first flight. My instructor landed, and we refueled and took off again. I was doing more circuits when it happened. I felt all of a sudden I had no energy. It was like someone pulled the power plug from a running appliance and it just shut down. My concentration just stopped. I couldn't think clearly. I was feeling like I was losing my balance. It was weird. I'd never experienced anything like this. With what little brain power I had left, I told the instructor I was feeling dizzy and he took over immediately. Remember, this was back in 1996. We didn't have words like brain fog in our daily vocabulary. I also felt like every time I talked I was slurring my speech like a drunk. Now, I must tell you, I didn't drink, nor did I do drugs. Here I was, 30 kilometres from home, and what I now called spaced out. These days, its medical name is PEM, post-exertional malaise. I couldn't concentrate. My mind was addled, my balance was gone, I felt exhausted, and don't forget, this was before everyone had a mobile phone, so I couldn't call my wife or friends for help. I wasn't sick enough to call an ambulance because, remember, I wasn't having a heart attack. So I did the only thing my brain would let me do, drive home. All I wanted was to be home. It was as if I couldn't think of anything else. My mind was stuck in a groove like a record, for the youngsters, like being on railway tracks. I don't know how I got home. I don't remember the drive. I don't remember leaving the flying club or how I said my goodbyes. All I remember is going home and going straight to bed to sleep. This was the first PEM attack. I've suffered the same kind of PEM attacks, often daily and often multiple times a day since 1996. It's rare for me to go 2 or 3 days without a PEM attack. What came after that day is a bit of a blur for me. Memory loss is a part of this condition. We moved to Brisbane about 3 months after the condition started. This was because I was offered a great work opportunity there, but I was having these PEM attacks daily. I was permanently exhausted and very scared. I had no idea what was going on with me. I felt exhausted, and something was changing in my gut. I found that I was getting reactions to many foods that I loved. It was weird. I used to joke that I could eat a horse between two mattresses, but not anymore. So now I had massive fatigue, brain fog, dizziness, sometimes confusion, and now a growing list of food intolerances, which morphed into irritable bowel syndrome, which over time got worse and worse. We went to many doctors to try to get answers, but none came. The various doctors' responses ranged from, "Oh well, you're just tired," to "It's all in your head." One doctor even told me I was a hypochondriac. While all this was happening, I worked in a high-stress job in an airlocked 21°C air-conditioned room monitoring burglar alarm systems for a security company. I worked on a 12-hour rotating roster system. From my computer terminal, I could monitor thousands of businesses and residential alarm systems in Brisbane and around the state. Worse, if we had a thunderstorm, which was as common as sneezing in Brisbane in summer, the system would go into meltdown with alarm faults and activations everywhere, causing a massively stressful workload. This, in turn, caused the PEM attacks to become more frequent and stronger in severity. I often had to phone my wife from work and get her to put our sleeping toddler into the car and drive across Brisbane in the middle of the night because I was so exhausted I couldn't drive home. I was often exhausted even before my shift started, so she'd drive me to work and then 12 hours later come and get me with our young son in tow. Even though we had family in Brisbane at the time, none offered any help, and most didn't believe I was sick. In fact, some close family members didn't believe my condition was real until I was finally diagnosed in 2023. But this was 1997, not 2023. I worked at the alarm monitoring company for 8 months with the same routine of exhaustion, IBS, and failed drives to and from, requiring my wife to either rescue me or taxi me back and forth. During this time, my wife was suffering from very severe postnatal depression compounded by the death of her father some 14 days after our son was born. My wife was extremely close to her dad, and they were as thick as thieves. Piled on top of all that stress was my illness and the drama that it caused. This brought my wife nearly to breaking point. At one stage, she seriously considered suicide. We, at the time, were too young to really understand what was going on with her mental health, and even if we had realized she needed counseling, it had such a stigma attached to it back in those days, I doubt she or I would have gone for it. Finally, my wife phoned me at work in a flood of tears, told me she was not coping with being a stay-at-home mum, and she frequently wanted to kill herself and our boy. So we agreed that she would get a job and I'd take over the home duties. She quickly got a job, and I became house dad. One would have hoped that things would improve. My wife was at work, I was at home with our son, and my stress levels lowered considerably. However, the PEM attacks kept coming, as did the food allergies, the IBS, and the other symptoms. There were many times I didn't feel safe looking after our son, but what could we do? My wife had to work, we had no family support, and we certainly couldn't afford full-time childcare. I'd get so exhausted that when it came to our son's sleep time, I'd immediately fall asleep myself. I trained myself to wake up as soon as he did, but it wasn't enough. I still had to, from time to time, call my wife from work back home to help. Again, other family members knew about this, but offered no help. This pattern actually cost my wife her job. She was fired because she spent too much time looking after my son and I. I remember a day when I had a cold or flu and couldn't stay awake looking after our son. By this time, I'd mastered looking after him using as little energy as possible. I'd lie on the couch most of the day and we'd play cars or Lego or read stories and watch TV in the lounge room. I would only get up to change his nappies or make lunch or go outside for the occasional playtime, where I'd either lie under a tree or on a blanket and keep an eye on the little fella. Anyway, I couldn't keep my eyes open on this particular day. I knew I was crook, and I knew I couldn't phone my wife for help as she was on a knife edge at yet another job because of me. So I phoned a close family member for help, but they didn't believe my condition was real and refused to help. I fell asleep and woke up to find our darling toddler covered in Indian ink. My wife had the set of fine art refillable pens for architecture. The set was boxed with a bottle of ink and 6 pens of different point types. She used them in high school and kept them because she'd dreamed of becoming an architect, and they were expensive. Seeing Dad was fast asleep, our darling son had decided that playing with the pens and ink would be the most fun. The little lad had gotten ink all over his face and hands, his clothes, and across the walls of the guest room, which we also used as a home office space. It took days to clean up the ink from the walls. My quest to find out what was wrong with me didn't stop, but every time I was met with, "I don't know, you're tired, it's nothing." Then, by chance, I wound up seeing an old doctor who was just about to retire. He'd spent many years in Kalgoorlie as a GP, but was retiring in Brisbane. He took one look at me and said, "You're dehydrated." He rattled around in the desk drawer and pulled out a bottle of salt tablets and got me to take one. The transformation was astounding. After only a few minutes, I felt like I could run a marathon and lift the entire doctor's surgery on my shoulders like Charles Atlas. Youngsters, you'll need to Google that. The doctor had no idea what was wrong with me, but he gave me an authority script for Repelite, hoping that it would help. An authority script is when a prescribed quantity or repeat is larger than the usual PBS quantity. He was the first doctor in 3 years who had been proactive. Repelite is basically sugar and salt, and it's used to replace fluids and minerals such as sodium and potassium lost due to diarrhea and vomiting. It helps prevent or treat dehydration. Repelite's no longer sold, so I now use ORS, or oral rehydration salts. They help me at least lessen some of the brain fog impacts of PEM attacks. They don't stop the attacks, but they seem to help me overcome them faster. However, there are times when nothing aids a PEM attack, and they can last days, weeks, and even years. I couldn't go to the movies, eat out, or attend public events like air shows or car shows. I couldn't go out to restaurants or even visit friends' houses. Even going to the local pool with the water sparkling in the sunshine and the movement of people swimming would trigger a PEM attack. Driving was almost impossible, and having a normal everyday life was over. It was over as soon as the conditions started, but I didn't want to face that. One of the other PEM triggers we realized was the weather, especially humidity. So, after a long search, and with the help of my mum, who had travelled extensively around Australia from her overseas-based job, we came up with the idea of moving to Albany in Western Australia. Albany was chosen solely because of its climate, which is a heap cooler and less humid than southeast Queensland. We rented a flat in Albany sight unseen and organised a second-hand shop to drop off a basic load of furniture to get us going. We did all this by phone and internet. This was late 1999, so the internet was unlike today's fast, high-bandwidth stuff. This was dial-up. Youngsters, you'll need to Google that too. We had very little money, so we sold everything we owned. We left Queensland in early 2000 with 6 suitcases, a pallet of freight, $600 in cash, and a set of plane tickets to Western Australia. And that was it. We'd never been to Western Australia and had no friends or family there. It was just my wife, our son, and me crossing the country to a new life, and so we hoped. During this entire time, my wife's mental health hadn't improved. However, over 4 days, my wife found a level of independence and self-confidence neither she nor I had ever seen. It turned out to be the beginning of her healing. Those 4 days started on the day we left Queensland. Our flight left Brisbane Airport at about 8:30 a.m. and I was already deep into a PEM attack. Imagine all the triggers, the stress of moving to a place you've never been to, getting to the airport on time and ensuring that we had everything packed as there was no going back. The stress was massive and I was out of it. We flew to Sydney, but on the flight my chair was broken and I was really uncomfortable. By the time we got to Sydney, I was beside myself. Because my mind has a habit of locking onto one subject during a PEM attack, I was convinced that the next plane, the one to Perth, was going to crash. No calm words or logic were going to change my mind, so I refused to board the plane to Perth. Luckily, my other mum, I had 2 mums, met us in Sydney to see us off on our grand adventure. Luckily, she could afford to buy me a train ticket from Sydney to Perth. We had no idea when the next train was going to Perth, but she reassured my wife she'd look after me until I was safely on my way. By now the plane was boarding, so after a hurried kiss goodbye with my wife and son and many tears, they departed flying on an aircraft I was still convinced was going to crash. My second mum and I took a taxi to Central Station in Sydney. We arrived at Central Station and found the train was leaving in about 3 hours. How lucky was that? The train only leaves twice a week. I would ride across the country on the train in a sleeper without luggage. No luggage because Qantas didn't have the time to offload our baggage, and this was before 9/11, so baggage security rules were not as tight as they are today. So my wife, with the baggage and our young son, headed to Western Australia minus one very spaced-out husband. I had a briefcase with a mobile phone but no charger, some cash and personal papers, and that was it, not even a change of clothes. I arrived in Perth 4 days later, stayed in a hotel near the East Perth bus station overnight, and took the bus to Albany the next day. I was very disappointed when I first arrived in Albany. The road into Albany on Albany Highway is lined on one side with car yards, and I thought, this place looks terrible. After a few minutes, we wound our way onto Princess Royal Drive, and I took my first view of the harbour. I was gobsmacked at how beautiful the place is. My wife and son met me at the bus stop with some new friends that they'd already made. My wife seemed different. She had a confidence that I'd never seen before. She says that having to go it alone first to Western Australia brought out in her a strength she never knew she had. Living in Albany was paradise, even though we were broke and relied heavily on Vincent de Paul for blankets and housewares, but after a while my wife got a job and I returned to looking after our son full-time. By this time our son was in pre-primary school, so I was child-free for 2 full days, and very soon he'd be at school full-time. I think it was a combination of our son going to school, the cooler climate, and quitting smoking that really helped me improve. By 2001, my PEM attacks ceased being near constant and had reduced a little. I was able to start gently exercising, which was something I'd not been able to do since 1996. It's important to note that even though the attacks lessened, they can still hit at any time and last all day. I can still get multiple days of attacks lasting hours on end, and don't forget the other symptoms. I'd put on a heap of weight. Food had become my comfort. I still had no real idea what my condition was, and eating gave me energy, made me feel good, and it became my addiction. Eventually, I weighed more than 220 kilos. Now, it's slowly coming off because I've mostly come to terms with the addiction, but that took the best part of 22 years. We as a family got into a routine, and in 2002 we had another child who was born 7 years to the day after our firstborn. My wife couldn't take long off work. We simply couldn't afford it. I wasn't on any Centrelink payments and wouldn't be until 2023, so I was house dad to a 7-year-old school kid and a new baby bub. I used all the experience I'd gained with our first child on the second, and with my health now more stable and the PEM attacks lessening, life was hard but manageable. I did the best I could as a house dad. I knew that I couldn't take my kids out and do typical dad stuff with them. There were no camping trips or holidays to faraway destinations. The best we could do was barbecues around Albany and Denmark. Occasionally, I'd take the kids fishing in Denmark. I'd sit in a chair with a rod in the water with no hook, so we were guaranteed not to catch a fish. We moved to Mount Barker in 2005 because my wife had secured a job there. Our elder son had difficulty growing up with a dad who couldn't do much. His friends had fathers who went shooting, camping, and ran farms. The most I could do was take relatively short walks and drive him occasionally to and from Albany. I still hadn't given up on discovering what was wrong with me, but the answers were exactly the same as in Queensland. It was, I don't know, you're tired, or it's nothing. In 2008, I saw a particular doctor in Mount Barker. I told him about my symptoms, and he responded, "Let's play a game of golf." He asked me to join him at the Mount Barker Golf Club the following weekend, so I rested up heaps for a few days prior and huffed and puffed my way around 9 holes. His diagnosis was, "Well, you seem fit enough. I think you just have an assorted accumulation of symptoms." This is when I gave up on doctors. For my wife, it had taken 8 healing years since we moved from Queensland. By 2008, my amazing wife had really found her feet and was going from strength to strength. The mental health issues of the past were well and truly behind her. Her support for me has been unwavering in the face of no information from the medical community, members of my and her family who doubted my condition. She even had a member of the public one day approach her and ask her why she was married to an obviously lazy husband who was making her work so he could laze around doing nothing. Through all of this, she stuck by me. In 2021, I was forced to go back to the doctor because I had an umbilical hernia which was causing me severe pain and illness. I was operated on, and from then on decided to keep going at least once a year for blood tests and general checkups. I did, however, form a good relationship with one particular doctor. She seemed to care, but more importantly, she listened to me, but I still didn't ask about my condition. My youngest son, who was now 19, didn't really have any issues with me being unable to do much. He's a born computer whiz, and going camping, fishing, and doing outdoorsy activities would, to him, be the stuff of horror movies. My two boys are very different in their own ways. We now arrive in 2023. My wife came home from work and informed me that her boss had been diagnosed with long COVID. I wanted to research it because I wanted to see if my wife's boss's illness would have any possible impact on my wife's work life. So I went to the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, United States government website. It's one of the best first source websites you can use when seeking health-related information. I certainly wouldn't advise going to chat or forum sites for health-related information. I was reading the CDC webpage titled Long COVID or Post-COVID Conditions when I came to a section called Symptoms that are Hard to Explain and Manage. In that section is a link titled Myalgic Encephalomyelitis or Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, ME, CFS. This stopped me in my tracks. I had guessed for some years that I had chronic fatigue, but I never knew for sure. I'm not a person who reads something and does a self-diagnosis. I never really spoke much about my condition to friends and acquaintances, and I'd given up with most of my family years ago. If asked, I would tell people I was a house dad, and when the kids left home, I was retired. If I did talk about it, I was deliberately vague. Anyway, back to the link titled Myalgic Encephalomyelitis, Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, ME, CFS. I clicked on the link and found a massive information on my condition. It was like reading a health manual for me. I was so shocked that so much information existed on a condition for which I couldn't get a diagnosis. How could this be, I wondered. Reading the following pages brought tears to my eyes. Here was my condition laid out with detailed explanations and levels of understanding I never knew existed. There were even pages of information for healthcare providers. My mind was spinning. The web pages are still there if you want to learn more about myalgic encephalomyelitis. As luck would have it, I had a doctor's appointment a few days later. So, at the very end of the appointment, I asked my doctor, "What do you think about chronic fatigue?" She replied, "It's a very serious condition." I had never heard this from a doctor before, so I said my goodbyes, went to reception and booked another appointment a few weeks later. The delay is because it takes ages to see a doctor in our town. These days, it can be 6 weeks. At the next appointment, I took my amazing wife with me and told my doctor the entire story. My doctor listened and looked at my records. After 20 minutes of listening and looking through my records, she looked at my wife and me and said, "I have no doubt, none whatsoever, that you have myalgic encephalomyelitis." I was stunned, happy and sad. My emotions were all over the place after all these years of no diagnosis. The doctor explained that she could rule out other things immediately because I'd been going to the doctor regularly and had had recent blood tests done. Also, the history I had given was basically textbook myalgic encephalomyelitis. I left the doctor's office in tears. 28 years it had taken. 28 years of doubt, 28 years of people not believing me, 28 years of not really knowing, 28 years with no income. My first goal was to claim disability support pension. I had gone so long with no income, so I logged into MyGov and started the paperwork. The application required a second diagnosis. This worried me. I had thoughts like, well, what if my doctor had just been kind? What if she was wrong? 6 weeks later, I had an appointment with a second doctor who, after reading my own doctor's notes, asked me a series of questions and, listening carefully, came to the conclusion that yes, I did have myalgic encephalomyelitis. Now, 2 doctors had given the exact same diagnosis. With help from a website called DSP Help, which is a free resource for DSP applicants and their support workers, I compiled all the required information for the disability support pension application. It took months, but after 5 months and 2 phone interviews, I was granted DSP. This is when I really believed my diagnosis. It was one thing for 2 doctors to believe me, but it was an entirely different kettle of fish that now the government believed I had myalgic encephalomyelitis and I was disabled. I get a reduced rate because my wife works, but that doesn't matter to me. I now had my own income. Christmas 2023 was the first time I could buy Christmas presents for my family in 28 years. During the DSP application process, I chatted with a woman who works extensively with the Mount Barker elderly population and advised her of my diagnosis. She'd known us for years. She was shocked that I was disabled because I don't look unwell. I approached her because I hoped to get my wife some help because my wife has to work full-time and then come home and do most of the housework. During the conversation, it was suggested that I contact Carers WA, so I did that, and they referred me to the Neurological Council of WA. This is when I met Charlotte. She's a community neurological nurse with the Neurological Council of WA, and her job, in a nutshell, is to be my health advocate. Since meeting Charlotte, she's organised physiotherapy, occupational therapy, and a dietitian. Charlotte also guided my wife through the process of applying for carers payments. She's provided me with advice, information, and sometimes just an ear, all of which has been invaluable. She also informed me about the Changing Places bathroom, which has changed my life for the better, the companion card, ACROD, and the WA fuel subsidy. So here we are. My story's not over. I know that only 3% of people fully recover from myalgic encephalomyelitis. I understand that this conditioning is life-limiting. I know I have to manage my energy carefully. I understand that a PEM attack and all the other symptoms can happen at a moment's notice. But it's okay. I have myalgic encephalomyelitis and I'm disabled. Notice I do not use chronic fatigue. Chronic fatigue has been used as an insult for years and was once even labelled yuppie flu by the media. Chronic fatigue doesn't correctly describe this condition. It is a complex multi-system condition, not just fatigue, so I don't use chronic fatigue. If ever you talk about this condition, please use ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis, because that is what it is. I don't feel sorry for myself. I look forward to every day. I don't dwell on what this condition has taken away from me. Yes, my life is vastly different from what it could have been, but I know that there are plenty of people out there doing it a lot harder than me. I'm grateful for my life. I am grateful to all those who've continued to support me. I have also, for the previous 31 years, had my wife's unwavering love and support, and as they've grown and understood my condition, my amazing kids have provided me with unconditional love and support as well. Oh, remember the apples? My wife tells me I could only eat apples during that virus that started all of this. I don't like apples anymore. June 2024.